Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining in for another conversation with Cory. This topic obviously is going to be dealing with the question, what does the Bible have to say about taxes and the government? Now, before we begin, I really want to express my condolences to the Floyd family with the recent incident that had taken place with George Floyd and just all that happened in Minneapolis. It's very tragic indeed, and so my prayers and my thoughts and my love are with the Floyd family, and so we'll definitely be keeping them in our prayers. And I know that before we dive into something that is what I like to refer to as a hot topic, this issue can be a very hot topic type of issue, and so I want to express to everyone that is listening and that is watching is that I am coming from a biblical standpoint. This is not to answer or express any type of political agenda. This is honestly to come from a biblical standpoint. What does the Bible have to say? I have no, partisan, I would say, when it comes to standpoints or views or everything. I want to be biblical. I stand with what the Bible has to say. Now, if you were to ask me some questions, you would most likely find out that my questions stand, or my answers stand a little bit more on the conservative side of things. But the fact of the matter is that you can label me as whatever you want. I am not going to label myself nothing else than a New Testament Christian. That is the only thing I'm going to label myself as, is a New Testament Christian. What does the Bible have to say? I want to be biblical. And folks, if this is going to be too much for you to chew, then I would really strongly encourage you to come back later and watch this video. If it's too much for you to chew and too big for you to swallow, because this can be a hot topic issue, but to go ahead and transition into the first part of this lesson. This answer is about taxes. This individual has asked me about taxes. What does the Bible say about paying taxes? Is it right for a Christian to pay taxes? Now, the short answer is yes. Yes. Christians are commanded to pay taxes. And it begins over in Mark chapter 12, if you have your Bibles. Mark chapter 12, beginning at verse 13. Mark chapter 12, verse 13 through 17 is going to be the answer to that first part of that question. Is, do Christians have to pay taxes? The answer is yes. Mark chapter 12, beginning at verse 13. And they sent to him some of the Pharisees and some of the Herodians to trap him in his talk. And they came and said to him, Teacher, we know that you are true and do not care about anyone's opinion. For you are not swayed by appearances, but surely teach the way of God. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay them or should we not? But knowing their hypocrisy, he, Jesus, said to them, Why put me to the test? Bring me a denarius and let me look at it. A denarius at that time was a day's wage for the laborer. Bring me a denarius and let me look at it. And they brought one. And he said to them, Whose likeness and inscription is this? They said to him, Caesar's. Jesus said to them, Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And they marveled at him. So in essence, what Jesus is saying is that, are his followers, Christians, are they to pay taxes? The answer is yes. They are to pay taxes. Now, what upsets me personally as being a biblical New Testament Christian is what and where our taxes are going to. Today, sadly, I'm not sure, I believe the president has actually wrote a bill out which is banning tax money to go to Planned Parenthood. If that's the case, then hallelujah, because I don't want my taxes to be going to the murder and the slaughtering of innocent babies. I don't want that. Yes, that makes me livid as a New Testament Christian. That makes me livid. One of the deadliest sins that God hates the most is hands that shed innocent blood. And does it make me angry, righteously speaking, that my money is going to endorse Planned Parenthood, the murder of innocent babies? Yes. Yes. I don't like that. That infuriates me. Just to think about it. But still, are we called to pay taxes? Yes, we are. I would love and enjoy less taxes in life. I would love that. That would be a blessing and an honor in life, would be less taxes. But regardless of the case, if it's less taxes or more taxes, we're called to render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. And that is to pay taxes. Now, in response to that, when it comes to the Christian's relationship with the government itself, how do we go about that? Well, if you turn over to Romans chapter 13, Romans chapter 13 would be the main text that we're going to deal with in regards to the Christian's relationship with the government. Romans chapter 13. And we're specifically going to look at the first 7 verses of that chapter, Romans chapter 13. Now, the general context of Romans 13, verse 1 through 7, has to do with the Christian's responsibility and relationship to the government under which he or she lives. And this embraces any government, ancient or modern, democracy, republic, communism, socialism, dictatorship, monarchy. This deals with ancient, modern, any type of government form. The instruction deals with principles that are very applicable to any political environment. The larger context includes the first 7 verses of this chapter in Romans 13. It says, "Let every person be subject to the government, to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes. For the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed." First thing that we need to understand from this context of Romans chapter 13, verse 1 through 7, is that we need to have a good understanding of God's absolute authority. Look at what Paul says in verse 1. "For there is no authority except from God." Paul is pointing out to God's absolute authority. All authority ultimately resides in God, who is the sovereign of the universe. He is the ruler over all the nations. Psalm chapter 22, verse 28, and 1 Chronicles chapter 29, verse 11. Kings, presidents, legislative branches, legislative bodies, executive branches, and so forth and etc., are subject to God and will be held accountable for how they administer civil affairs. They will be held accountable. Key thought and key understanding. They will be held accountable for how they have conducted civil matters. Bible history is repetitive with evidence establishing this premise of God's absolute authority. Keep that in mind. God ultimately has the overall authority in the entire universe. And so after having a good understanding of that, we need to also understand from the text about God delegating his authority to others. We see here that God delegates his authority over to others. He says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted or delegated by God." The Lord has delegated authority to individuals or offices in certain areas. To maintain societal order, the Lord has decreed that civil authorities are to enact and administer laws for the well-being of the human family. The grand moral principles that are progressively revealed in the scriptures should be the general guidelines for crafting civil law. This was the primary basis of law that was crafted in this country's infancy, though we are rapidly, digressing from this exalted concept. Now, rulers are responsible to implement laws that reinforce conduct that is good, from what Paul says. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. So their responsibility is to implement laws that reinforce conduct that is good, which would be morality, which would be healthy and beneficial to its citizens. They must also establish penalties and punishments for actions that are hurtful to individuals and destructive to the moral fabric of the nation. National degeneracy contributes to the eventual fall of a people. Psalm chapter 9, verse 17. So they have been enacted to punish bad conduct, not to embrace bad conduct, but to punish bad conduct and to embrace good conduct. Which is why Paul rhetorically asks the question, would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. Think about capital punishment that we have here. Why is it that we put murderers on death row? Why? Because of bad conduct. Why is it that when murderers commit the act of murder and they tend to try to flee from the authorities, they tend to go into hiding? Why? Because they're afraid of getting caught and facing the consequences of their actions. Hence is why we have murderers that go into hiding. Murderers, they run from the law, or they even try to flee the country. That is why the civil authorities, they put out warrants for people's arrest. Keep a lookout on this guy. He committed this bad act, and we're trying to capture him before he commits any other bad acts, and he needs to face the consequences of his or her actions. So the thing that really upsets me is that within this nation, people get an uproar about capital punishment. Oh, it's inhumane, it's not right. Well, that's what they're supposed to do. That is one of the reasons why God instituted the system of government, a body of government, whichever type that is. Democracy, republic, I already named them earlier. But whatever type of government that has been instituted, that is why God created the system to begin with. In the first place, was to embrace good conduct and was to punish bad conduct. And to follow and to decide what is good and what is bad, you had to follow the guidelines of God's law, of God's standard. It was always, since the beginning, supposed to be his guideline, his standard to be the guideline to determine what is right, what is wrong, and to embrace the good and to punish the bad. And so after having an understanding of God delegating his authority to others, we also need to understand about God's providential activity among the nations. It is important to understand that nations are not operating exclusively unto themselves. The Creator may use civil authorities who are intrinsically evil to facilitate his ultimate plan for humanity. An example of this would be King Nebuchadnezzar in the Old Testament. He was known to be the Lord's servant to punish the wayward kingdom of Judah. But the monarch was a wicked man personally and individually and would be judged eventually. Jeremiah chapter 25, verse 8 through 12. When Paul wrote this letter to the Christians at Rome, the emperor at the time was Nero, the very man who sentenced Paul to death. As vile as Emperor Nero was, the Christians in the imperial city of Rome were to be submissive to his administration in all matters that did not violate their Christian responsibilities. What would be a violation of their Christian responsibilities? Well, we see examples of that as well. In Acts chapter 5, when the apostles were out preaching the good news of Jesus Christ, they're brought before the higher authorities, and they commanded the apostles to stop preaching Jesus Christ. Well, Peter, James, and John, and the apostles, they said, Acts chapter 5, verse 29, we must obey God rather than man. Folks, that is the only time when we are not to adhere to the civil authorities is when they establish a rule or regulation that goes against God's higher standard. Such other examples would be abortion. We stand against that. Why? Because abortion is against God's standard. Hands that shed innocent blood, that is murder. We stand against it. Same-sex marriage. The Bible plainly states that same-sex attraction and same-sex marriages, it's wrong. God had never ordained that at all. Ever since the beginning, it was one man, one woman for life. He created Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. So we stand against same-sex marriages. Even though back in June of 2015, when the country federally legalized homosexuality marriages, does that mean that ministers and preachers are to marry homosexual couples? Absolutely not. That is when we need to take a stand, just as Peter, James, and John did in Acts chapter 5, verse 29. We must obey God rather than man. So folks, there's many other examples that we could indicate where it comes to violating the Christian's responsibilities or violating God's standard. The only time when we don't obey the civil matters of authority is when it goes against the Christian responsibility and following God's standard. Also, I want us to recognize about the use of force. We kind of already mentioned a little bit about capital punishment, but it also indicates the fact that if you do wrong, he would be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. Folks, this also, as capital punishment, would also support the idea of having to go to war if necessary. And so they have the authority to use force if necessary in order to punish bad and evil conduct. That is capital punishment through criminals and capital punishment, through war, against terrorists if necessary. Governments are accountable to God. If it's a government that is not following God's guidelines and refusing to follow his overall standard, his biblical principles, then they're going to be held accountable for their actions on that great and final day of judgment, unless they get things right with God first. Until then, they're going to be held accountable when they stand before the judgment seat of Jesus Christ. Now, Peter, when it comes to following civil matters of the government authority, when it does not compromise God's standard, Peter tells us in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 13, submit yourselves to every human institution. Now, what's interesting is the way that Peter uses that word submit in the Greek. It literally means to voluntarily place yourself under another even when you disagree. I said it before and I'll say it again as a broken record because I don't want anyone to misunderstand me. The only time that we don't submit to the government authority is when it compromises God's standard, is when they establish something that's against God's standard. Because remember, God is the ultimate authority. He has the absolute authority. His standard rises way above the government standard. So out of the two, I'm going to follow God's standard instead. But now when the government regulates something, or Peter says every human institution regulates or establishes a rule that does not go against the Christian responsibility or does not go against God's standard, then we are to voluntarily place ourselves under another even when we disagree. Now, here's where I would say a lot in the brotherhood may not like to hear. I would say that get your stones ready if you like. You can feel free to disagree with me if you like. But let's just take, for an example, the right to bear arms. Can you show me anywhere in the New Testament where it says that the Christians have the right to bear arms? Can you show me anywhere in the New Testament where if they were to take away that Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, can you show me anywhere in the New Testament where it violates God's standard? If that were to happen, if, capital I, capital F, if that were to happen, what would you do? It doesn't go against your responsibility as being a Christian and preaching the gospel of Jesus. It doesn't go against God's standard. So what are you going to do? You only have two options. Someone had told me saying that, well, there's the example in the Old Testament where God has allowed his people to use weapons of force and military attacks. Well, here's the thing, though. That's military. Military falls under capital punishment of Romans 13. We're not talking about military use of force. We're talking about the right to bear arms as those who are non-military citizens. What if the government were to take that amendment away? What would you do? And folks, please do not misunderstand me. Do not get me wrong. I am all for the Second Amendment. I am all for the Second Amendment. And I will peacefully and respectfully take my stand for the Second Amendment. But if all comes down to it and civil government authority has to say, all right, well, guess what? We all voted and Second Amendment's out. Would it be hard for me to hand over my weapon? Well, yeah, it'd be difficult. And again, some may not like to hear that thought. Some may not like to follow that. A lot in the brotherhood may tend to try to ignore that. But folks, from my study in scripture of the New Testament, nowhere in the New Testament does it say that Christians have the right to bear arms. And nowhere in the New Testament does it say that God's standard says that you have the right to carry a weapon or a sword wherever you want. I don't find that anywhere in the New Testament. I don't see how it violates God's standard or how it violates our Christian responsibility if that were to be taken away. So again, what would you do? Well, that answer is going to be for you to answer within yourself and for you to answer, to God with it. And so as we bring this session to an end, I hope everyone has a little bit of a good understanding about our relationship to the government when it comes to paying taxes. Yes, number one, we answered that from Mark chapter 12, verse 13 through 17. We are, in fact, required to pay taxes. Romans chapter 13, verse 1 through 7 informs us that we are to pay taxes to the government. And also, our relationship to the government is that we are to submit to them, voluntarily place ourselves under another, even when we disagree, as long as it does not violate our Christian responsibility and as long as it does not violate God's law. If it does violate our responsibility in God's law, then we must obey God rather than man. But if it does not violate our responsibility or God's standard, then we have to place ourselves under their authority even when we disagree. Overall, in the end, they will be held accountable to God, who is the sovereign over all the universe. I hope this answers your question, and if you have any other follow-up questions with that, if you'd like to share your comments, your thoughts, please feel free. You can share them in the comments below on Facebook, or this will be uploaded on the YouTube channel. Please feel free to share your comments below as well. Only to a certain extent. I will not tolerate any foul language whatsoever. Any threats I will not tolerate. So if you decide to try to threaten or use foul language or try to attack any of my brothers and sisters in the comments section below, verbally speaking, then I will not tolerate it one bit. So please feel free if you have any questions concerning a certain topic or passage in the Bible that you'd like for me to study and provide an answer to in one of our sessions of Conversation with Cory. Please feel free to message me privately or ask your questions in the comments below as well. Anyway, if there's any way you can get a hold of me, just find a way to get a hold of me and ask your question or any follow-up questions regarding this topic or any other topic or text in the Bible. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I appreciate you all so very much, and I hope you have a blessed day.